Hello, I'm Bob Gorley, the Chief Technology Officer of OODA LLC. This recording captures content from our 18 October 2022 OODAcon. OODAcon was an event designed to bring together people from our community to talk about this age of exponential innovation and disruption so we can all learn how to better survive and thrive. We titled this next session, Future Wars. Future Wars was a discussion between two noted analysts who are deeply engaged in understanding the geopolitical and military risk environments we find ourselves in. John Robb is author of the book Brave New War and produces the Global Guerrillas Report and is continually engaged in understanding the geopolitical threat risk environment. J.D. Work is a long-term cyber threat analyst and is now teaching his craft based upon his experience at Columbia University, National Defense University, and Marine Corps University. Together, they examine a wide range of topics, including the many aspects of Russia's war against Ukraine.
Absolutist in its nature. But there's a belief that somehow this is going to lead to fundamental change within Russia in a way that I think is perhaps politically naive. And unfortunately, as we drive into these the more complex outcomes, Ukraine has had some stunning battlefield successes.
Right.
They are enabled by a set of support from a variety of global actors that are incredibly concerned that a nuclear armed power not be able to just unilaterally annex territory in any context. But there is not the Western sense that they've directly engaged in this war themselves. The other side, however, believes a very different thing about this. The Russians have a structure of thought that they are already fighting NATO. And this puts us in a very difficult place because, again, I used to work heavily with the late Bob Jervis, and his work on perception and misperception in the international system was very formative of how I think about this. For me, the retaliatory and escalatory options that we're facing, particularly in the cyber domain, as a strategic substitute, to quote Professor Fiona Cunningham, in lieu of nuclear options, where the nuclear taboo might hopefully still hold, although we are increasingly getting to the point where we have to question that. I had personally expected to see offensive cyber in the deep strike model earlier. We look at the strategic writings of Kokoshkin. We think about how they've implemented capabilities in certain organizations. I would have expected, frankly, Europe to be shivering in the dark last winter. This winter, we're almost certainly going to see something different. And we just saw the Prestige ransomware campaign in Poland, where we saw a hit on strategic transportation targets under this unattributed, unknown new player that doesn't have any of the traditional TTP or backstory of the known ransomware actors. But they're exploiting the strategic latency of vulnerability across systems and networks. We saw in the weeks prior to the invasion a series of hits by ransomware actors on a variety of likewise vulnerable targets in the oil and gas industry, transportation sectors, that illustrated very much the strategic latency. But the question, of course, if the adversary is planning, as we believe, a Storm 333-like short operation for rapid covert action seizure of Kiev, was that mechanism necessary at that time versus how do they look at this now? How much are they learning from these behaviors of disaggregated actors?
I think they were completely caught off guard. I mean, granted, the initial plan to invade Ukraine was a terrible idea. They couldn't execute it. But the events that have occurred since then has caught everyone off guard. This network swarm emerged so quickly, and it captured most of the government actors, super empowered individuals like Musk coming forward with Starlink, people inside of companies, individuals, in various bureaucracies everywhere, all operating in concert to prosecute the war, both to fund it at a private level and to make attacks on the private level, and make sure that Russia was completely disconnected. They didn't anticipate it. We didn't anticipate it. Unfortunately, a lot of the people here in the U.S. administration kind of decided to try to lead it and kind of frame the conflict as a fight against anti-democracy at a global level, both domestically and everywhere else. And at a certain level, that's useful in politics here domestically, but within the context of this conflict, it's dangerous. Problem with networks of this type, and I tracked them from open source warfare in Iraq when there were 70 different insurgent groups who were fighting, and how they communicated and operated, and why it made it so difficult to actually fight them. All the way up through our political, networks that were now our politics is network driven, and Twitter is upstream of the media, and networks drive the media as well as politics. Kind of like the sausage factory before it's actually delivered. What we're seeing in the current global conflict is that this network is maximalist. It doesn't have any proportionality. It doesn't negotiate. It wants complete submission of its target, and that it won't accept anything but that, and that it's been trained to do that. It's been successful in the past. If they ran up against a target that they didn't, or they were trying to take down, even if it's down to the individual, hapless individual that happens to be caught in its sights, that the entire network was mobilized to come down on its head. And there's no way to turn it off. There's no way to mitigate it. No one's in charge because there's so many different people contributing to it. And to a certain extent, it doesn't have a sense of mortality. It doesn't sense that there's any kind of physical peril involved in what it's currently doing or what it does at every step of the way. I think that maybe it's because we spend so much time in the abstract world, and we don't even recognize that we're spending so much of our lives, and we have so much of our mind space in this kind of online space that we've divorced or separated the consequences of our actions online from what happens in the physical world. And it's becoming manifest in this conflict. All the traditional kind of dance that nuclear powers had in terms of working things out, and it's a difficult dance, particularly when there's a war occurring on the border of one of them, was really kind of thrown out. All the things that kept us safe and out of nuclear war and out of World War III for 70 years is forgotten overnight. It's discredited to a certain extent by the network. And so,
how many folks have experience even thinking about strategic matters?
Right.
They don't understand the basics of nuclear weaponeering. They don't understand how fights happen. They've also devalued the cost of war generally. They've seen horrific casualties, but it's a short Twitter clip that you can laugh at when a tank hits a mine. It's a level of callousness that only occurs when you don't have skin in the game.
Yeah, and we're also, at least in the network sense, very vulnerable to empathy, in the sense that a lot of the barriers we have to empathy, which is really not a kind of a voluntary thing, is an involuntary modeling of somebody else's mind. So you become one with them, and it's a kind of a pre-verbal communication system, is that you can build empathy triggers online, and you send them out, and people react strongly to it. They immediately connect and become one with the victim. And then you get these mass movements where people are acting very strongly to defend them. And there's really no consideration for any kind of mitigating factors or that may cause more problems in the long term. A lot of this is goes back to Marshall McLuhan, and he goes, hey, we're the global village, and that global village isn't a really good thing. A global village means we're global villagers, and all the nasty stuff that happens at the global village or the village level in the past, like the pogroms and the witch trials and things like that, happen now, because we're in everybody else's mind space. They're appearing. Their thinking is appearing right on our phone, right next to us. It's like invading us. We can't stand that kind of that dissonant kind of thinking so close to us. Is that Marshall McLuhan said, hey, the way we're going to survive this, becoming global villagers, is we're going to build a social artifact. And, all the AI tech, for the most part, isn't building AGI, it's building social AIs. And those are going to be the symbionts that they're going to live among us to mitigate our behavior and help us out and help us survive in this long term. I mean, the whole socioeconomy will be built into this artifact. And a lot of the squabbling now that we see online politically is who gets to set the rules for that artifact. Is it a maximal stack of values, or is it a minimal stack that allows personal autonomy? Personally, I'm more on the autonomy side, because I think that's more flexible to have a system that balances consensus and dissent, and that if the consensus is wrong, the dissent can actually rise up to kind of stop it or slow it. Whereas a maximal stack will shut that down, and you won't see any dissent because it's built into the infrastructure to block it. We saw a little bit of that in COVID, like for instance, the source of COVID. Was it the human error, or was it being, naturally emerged from nature? That was shut off as a discussion. I worry about what I call that the long night, is that if it gets built into infrastructure that lock in this consensus, this maximal value stack, this pre-approved way of looking at the world, that's the end. We don't evolve, we don't go anywhere, we don't dynamically respond to danger. If the environment changes, we flatline.
I share your concern where we build sense-aware into our systems of sense-making and perception and the communication of consensus in political formation.
Right.
This is disastrous in every time it's ever been tried. We've seen this in assessing adversary behavior. We've seen this in the current structures we use to eliminate things that are truly bad, spam and other negative things in our online presences. But we're doing so with a set of algorithms which are basically dumb as rocks. And we're breaking a lot of very smart folks that are talking in ways that are not tied to these kind of masses of, again, without being elitist, we are in Virginia where, there is a long-standing distrust of the mob in politics, to the extent that we see mobilized mobs in these sense, they traditionally have had a poor impact on political outcomes.
Right.
But the restraining the passions of these political actors through such blunt instruments. I mean, I've joked that we're not going to create artificial general intelligence. We're going to create an infovore as our first true AI because it's designed around our censorship. It is growing beyond its bounds.
Yeah, I mean, it was apparent back in 2018 or so that the nation state had outsourced political stability and social stability to corporations. And corporations had built on the cheap, in a scalable way, a totalitarian level infrastructure that could, if it was exploited in a negative way, would become the ultimate of control system. That wasn't possible in the 20th century, where you'd need legions of bureaucrats and massive police systems in order to implement.
It was the aspiration of every Stasi, but
Yeah, but they built it on the cheap. And something that could actually mitigate, conversations down to the individual level, for billions of people simultaneously. And now we're about to hit AR, and I'm more on the AR side than the VR. VR is gaming space. It always was. So Zuckerberg and his company is building basically PlayStation. Doesn't know it. He thinks he's going to be mainstreamed. But AR is going to be this digital overlay that will, the next 15 years, go from 0 to 6 billion people. So just like 15 years ago, smartphones, nobody. now 6 billion. And it will be auditory and visual, perceptual control. And if we're destabilized just from the kind of talking space, the social networking, I was working on back in 2001, it's like, man, it's scary to think of what's going to happen with that kind of control over perceptions. We were talking about digital, autonomy, kind of way to kind of stabilize the system. I kind of became a little bit more concrete on that. I testified in the Senate last fall about this, what I had the hapless Facebook exec that was being attacked by all the senators. Man, that guy was sweating bad. He was really. Ted Cruz is vicious when you see him in person. Luckily, it wasn't me, but it was the actual concrete suggestion to kind of stabilize this and make it possible for us to progress positively in the future was digital rights, to ensure that we have a dissent, and then what the constraints on that dissent are. Data ownership, meaning that you control your data, and that is better than the privacy solutions, because privacy solutions typically rely on a regulator or destroying the data. If you own the data, then you have data brokers like with a fiduciary duty to kind of protect you, like you have banks and brokers protecting your money. People who represent you, and there's a legions of lawyers being funded by that protection that will make sure that your data is being properly represented and maximized. And all of that data is being used to build the most valuable social, technological artifacts that we've ever built. And we'll continue to build these artifacts. So it's good to be able to have some stake in that future economy. And the final piece is open access. You don't want anyone choosing for you the tools that you can use in your perceptual stream. And right now it's like restricted because we're not in an open computing platform, we're in a closed system on the smartphone, is that two players with complete control over the store, right? And they charge a 30% tax on that whole economy. And now they're going to be, if there's two players in the AR space, then they charge a 30% tax on the digital economy spawned by that. It'll be a 10x what we see with this in the smartphone. And they get to set the parameters of what you actually can get in your system. And that kind of control is not something we want them to have. We want it open. And as much as it's disruptive, and as much as it's, people would say it's dangerous, it is much worse to cede control to corporations at that level. And, we could put some minimal stack kind of container around it, a legal stack, that would prevent these like open stores and open access to prevent it from being horribly abused. But we got to make sure that it's not a maximal stack, that the one that dictates exactly what you can have access to in your perception, and dictates what exactly you can see and hear. Because these AR devices, man, they're going to be something you can't live without. You don't want to turn off. And they'll correct your vision, they'll correct your hearing. They'll add digital layers to everything. If you do modified gaming right now, like open world Skyrim, you can see this kind of acceleration of all these mods coming out that will change everything. You can change everyone's clothes. You can add digital characters of certain types. You can add advisors that will actually stand there. You can change facial features. You can change how people look, how people interact. You can change just little things like the sound and the voices and the directionality of it, and it is amazing, and it's going to be so much better for so many people around the world in terms of how they live their lives. So I want to ask a question of you: is what do you? I know you're restricted in this to a certain extent. Is what are you seeing in terms of kind of this open source attack on Russia in terms of hitting their systems? How is a swarm advancing their cause?
So, to the extent that Russia perceives things as attacks that are really risk decoupling from these private actors engaging in things intended to respond to this de facto embargo and the risks that they bring. Mm-hmm. For example, early in the conflict, when a variety of aircraft manufacturers would no longer provide telemetry or support to engines for leased aircraft, or leased aircraft could not even be used under the terms. That's cloud in an operational sense that really disconnected some things they weren't expecting. They perceive that as a direct attack on their networks. It's not how any of us think about offensive cyber operations, but it was a conflation of concepts in their discourse that really set the tone for a series of other things. We then begin to see failure of maintenance systems, failure of telemetry in industrial control systems processes from a series of these outcomes where it's much harder then to argue that this wasn't a deliberate attack. It was simply they didn't pay for maintenance, or they could not pay because of sanctions for maintenance on some of their systems. Already poorly maintained, already poorly structured. We also then began to see a series of actors that were, in some ways, the folks that were invited initially by the government of Ukraine and were self-affiliating with the government of Ukraine in this IT army. And they weren't terribly effective in a military cyber operations sense. It was a consensus building mechanism. It was a morale building mechanism. It was a way for folks in Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora to act and perhaps attract others into it. We did, however, see a much more significant set of players that had been acting against Russia and China and other authoritarian regimes for some time, compromising a number of Russian defense industrial base networks. One of these, I don't know if you've seen the persona Against the West, but it's routinely been dropping large amounts of sensitive data exfiltrated allegedly from Russian networks in these hack and leak operations. These Russian defense industrial base entities are getting absolutely pwned left and right. We're seeing tons of this data just flowing out of these networks. I think longer term, that's absolutely crushing to military secrecy, to a whole variety of things. It's a vulnerability that they were aware of but had never seen pressure on in the same way. We also have begun to see a series of actions that I would have considered exceptionally destabilizing in a vacuum. Early in the conflict, we saw an attempt to execute intrusions against Roscosmos, largely because of some very provocative statements, sort of very bluntly evil and insane statements made by the then director of the organization. But we have long said that attacks on early warning infrastructure, on military sensing satellites, are a very escalatory exchange in the context of potential nuclear concerns. If you lose visibility on your early warning systems, you don't know if a nuclear attack is coming. This makes states incredibly nervous. It's very risky. It's very escalatory behavior. It was one of the first things that a series of these independent actors attempted to do and claimed success on. Now, the Russian government claims that they did not have the success. We can contested facts, right? Not being on those networks, not having digital forensic artifacts, it's very hard to say what happened. But out the gate, seeing that action was incredibly concerning, because everything we've talked about cyber war over time, managing communication between contested parties, managing escalation, to see all of that thrown away immediately was shocking, really.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine embraced open source warfare right from the get-go, so it changed the dynamics of the players. I mean, the U.S., it was relegated to funding and weapons, and they limited the weapons that they provided, and didn't directly support the operation, but they went to super empowered individuals like Musk to get unique technologies and employ them, which is kind of biting them in the ass a little bit now, but it was supercharging their efforts right now. Musk is putting a geofence around Crimea, and he's slowing the advance to make sure that it doesn't turn into a rout. He's conducting his own foreign policy in that regard. And then they outsourced.
There's a bit of contested facts there.
Yeah. Was
that a deliberate attempt to slow the advance, or was it simply initially a failure to coordinate and expect just how far that advance would push, pushing beyond the boundaries of the logistics line?
Yeah, I agree. And but the immediate effect or response from the network was that he's slowing it, and that they outsourced the propaganda and the moral war at a global level to this swarm. And the danger comes is that usually what would happen is once Ukraine got to the point where they were about to retake Crimea, which then would go into kind of territorial integrity of Russia, and then prompt a nuclear exchange, is that you get the U.S. and Europe would come and bang heads, put Zelensky in a headlock and say don't. okay, you're going to have to accept this. This is the way it's going to go. But Zelensky doesn't have to listen anymore. And he has the option of just going with the network, going with the swarm, and saying, I have global support, I'm going to keep on going. And that, the administration, if any indicator from, the lack of policy and academic experts even speaking out right now is any has any validity going forward, is that the administrations of all these different governments won't say anything, won't try to fight it.
And Crimea is not Russia, but Russia has asserted things that, as part of their occupation of territory, that are unacceptable in the international system, but where we don't have a good war termination scenario yet.
Right. I mean, there isn't any. The abstract space that you think this through is typically difficult to actually put together. There's so many moving factors. It's deep into the psychology of the opponents. That's been heavily corrupted by the network's influence. So it makes it hard for anyone to actually talk about this now, and put together this kind of ideational space in any way that can drive a solution.
So how is the ideational space changing in the Russian side of this? We've seen, for example, the success of first movers being the ones to evade the draft and the mobilization. We've seen an absolute crushing effect on their technical talent in a variety of contexts. We've seen folks that bailed on the country when early in the conflict. And of course, those that didn't move fast enough wound up mobilized with, I think it's a 10-day lifespan in the front now, which is, quite surprisingly short. But we've seen, famously a talk show host get mobilized and lose all credibility with his audience because he objected, given that he was old and no longer fit for frontline service. And but we're not necessarily getting the full picture of this yet from their elite's reaction.
I think in general, Putin faces more risk from losing than he does from escalating inside Russia. But that's up for debate. And that there were clear indicators just recently with the Kerch Bridge explosion. The response to that was counter-value attacks against Ukraine, going from attacking military targets primarily to bombing cities, and now an additional expansion of that using drones. And if they get enough Ukrainian drones, the way they can use them is just go after systems and all across Ukraine, meaning that the point defenses that we're going to deliver won't be effective at stopping their effectiveness. That is an indicator that if push comes to shove in the future, that we may see Putin going past or jumping past tactical nukes and going straight to counter value. He's getting all sorts of threats from the West at what the response would be to tacticals, and then escalation beyond that puts us in a situation where the only way that we could respond to him taking out cities, small cities, at the start, is that we start to trade cities with him. And if he's willing to do that, that's like go straight to Matt. And it's also a totem to the West that says basically, stay away. We're a nuclear power. They don't think they're being treated as one. They think they're vulnerable without that being reinforced. Don't interfere in our systems. Don't fund insurgencies. Don't fund coups. Stay out.
That upends all of the traditional thinking on counterforce and damage limitation, on limited exchanges.
I think we're beyond the kind of tactical kind of, we're going to enhance our military's operation by using nuclear weapons. We're right to counter value. We're like up to the point where it's.
So if we think of this, if we think of Syria as a battle lab that in some ways was almost like the Spanish Civil War, we think of this perhaps the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, 1871, where we're learning how great powers fight in a different way now. What does the change of that counterforce logic or emphasis on the countervalue logic tell us about a future fight in Taiwan or elsewhere in the Pacific?
Yeah, a lot of the posturing we're doing right now is in large part being driven by a fear of Chinese action in Taiwan. And even what we just recently did with chips is part of that.
I think we should unpack that. But
Yeah, if you want to go into the kind of the impact of the recent move on microprocessors and what that would do to Chinese behavior going forward, go ahead. I mean, they've been, everyone knows they're crawling over our systems all the time, every system, and it's been relatively undeterred until now.
Can you deter that class of action? I mean, I'm strongly on the record of saying cyber espionage in the competition space is not a deterrence class of problem. Effects operations and things at or above threshold of armed conflict might be a deterrence problem,
right,
in different ways, particularly through the network. Diplomatic and economic instruments are a different equation than classic deterrence theory. When we go to a wide-scale, unexpected decapitation of technical investments and the ability to engage in particularly American markets, we've not expected this. I don't think the other side expected this. It's a rather aggressive policy move. Again, I don't make policy. I don't comment on the wisdom or not of policy decisions. But the other side has feelings about this strongly and will be reacting. I do not know many shops that had an estimate before Friday on Chinese reactions to that move. There's a lot of folks on the back foot trying to understand where intrusion sets morph, where changes occur. We've had in the past credible commercial intelligence reporting, for example, of intrusions against multiple Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing firms. The discussion of occupation of Taiwan was always one of race conditions. Could a military action seize control of certain manufacturing facilities before they were destroyed in a counter-value denial strategy that would, where, scorched earth, one of the factors that deter conventional invasion of Taiwan is, well, you're not going to get what you think out of it.
Has this made this worse?
Well,
I mean, by emphasizing that yeah.
These are great thoughts, and I have one last concluding thought as we transition to the next session, which will be lunch. I would love for both of you guys to tell us, how can we read more about these topics? What's a great source other than OODA Loop, which you guys already read? How do we read your guys' stuff? Where do you write?
Go ahead.
I publish in a variety of journals, Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. I've written on cyber and escalation. In this context, I've spoken in a variety of contexts around intelligence tradecraft at places like SANS, a few others. Pretty broad number of channels I've been putting things out into.
Yeah, I have a Global Gorillas report. It's a relatively small community, about 1,000 of us or so, a couple billionaires, kind of cool. But it's on Substack and Patreon. It's like $5 a month kind of thing. Forces me to get up and write, which is that's what you're paid for, is like kind of an incentive for make sure that I actually get things out. It's pretty straightforward. I deal with a lot of topics. My timing tends to be a little early. Most of the stuff is I start talking about it, and that sucks as an entrepreneur. I was early on social networking in 2001 building. We did RSS and we did the early network blogging platform. But it sucks because that was too early for people to actually adopt.
Too far out, not living but drowning.
Yeah, and the same thing with a lot of my stuff. It's like 3, 4, 5 years too soon. But if you like that kind of stuff, that's where to get it.